It has been labeled one of the most perfectly made movies in American history, a narrative so affecting that it not only identified a generation, but also won all 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay, an accomplishment only 2 other movies in history have ever done. A film, yes, but more than that, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest went on to become a cultural lightning rod that changed the way audiences and critics understood mental illness, institutional power, and challenges to authority forever. But what most fans never knew was that the tale behind the film doesn't stop with what they saw on the screen. The real madness, the experiments that risked harming others, and the blurred boundaries between fiction and reality occurred off-camera in the corridors of an actual psychiatric hospital, where patients and actors coexisted in ways that tested everyone's sanity. Jack Nicholson's acting as Randall Patrick McMurphy was so uncomfortably real that hospital workers often confused him with one of the actual patients. And he was hardly the only one to become lost in the world of insanity the filmmakers created. What happened on set was more sinister, more dangerous, and much more disturbing than anything that ever appeared in movie theaters. It wasn't just making a movie. It was a psychological test, one that pushed boundaries and left indelible scars on those who took part. The journey to getting One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest onto the screen itself was a tale of fixation, tragedy, and on the verge of collapse. It all started not with Nicholson, not with director Milos Forman, but with Hollywood icon Kirk Douglas. Having appeared in the Broadway stage production of Ken Kesey's 1962 novel, Douglas bought the film rights in 1963, certain he had found a role for a lifetime. He thought McMurphy was his signature character, and his box office drawing power would ensure the movie's success. Hollywood spurned him, however. Studio after studio rejected the project as too downbeat, too inflammatory, too grim to market. For almost a decade, Douglas's dream was repeatedly crushed, only to leave him frustrated but stubbornly intent. His son, Michael Douglas, later confirmed that Kirk had become fixated, unable to relinquish the project that consumed him. The tragic irony was that Michael finally got independent funding years later. By then, Kirk had aged out of the role. In one of the most difficult discussions of his life, as he later recalled, Michael had to inform his father that the role he had struggled for years would be given to someone else. Nicholson, in full bloom of his charisma and raw power, would assume the role, and the rest is history. Since major studios wouldn't even consider the film, producers looked to an unexpected ally. Fantasy Films, a low-rent operation without access to the wealth of Hollywood titans. But this rejection was ultimately their best friend. Without studio interference, filmmakers were able to take risks and make daring decisions, and they did. The most startling of these was to film not on a constructed set, but within a working psychiatric hospital, the Oregon State Hospital. This wasn't merely done for authenticity's sake. It was an insistence on placing the cast and crew in a world where the distinction between real patients and fictionalized characters would become so indistinct as to be impenetrable. Dr. Dean Brooks, the hospital's superintendent, let the production use the facility, but with one shocking requirement: actual patients needed to be employed as extras and crew. About 80 patients served on the movie, playing group therapy scenes, fleshing out background shots, and impacting the actor's insight into mental illness in ways that no rehearsal could. Reality and performance crashed from the very first day. The patient actors were not treated as Hollywood stars. They were told to stay in the hospital wards, sleep in patient rooms, eat institutional food, and stick to the hospital's daily regimen. Danny DeVito, who acted Martini, described how fast the feeling of confinement crept into their heads. The locked doors, the regimentation, the round-the-clock monitoring, it made them feel institutionalized themselves. Though they could walk out, technically, it gave them a tactile sense of the world their characters lived in, but it also started to confuse their own borders between performance and actual experience. Sidney Sick, the man who played Chesick, had the most trouble with immersion. He started developing signs of emotional trauma that even the hospital staff found disturbing. The crew feared he was losing his grip on reality, and insisted he be relocated out of the ward during shooting. Likewise, Brad Dourif, who performed as the stuttering Billy Bibbit, was so immersed in his character's vulnerability that he frequently remained in character between scenes, shaking and collapsing in ways that seemed too real to be manufactured. Casting itself was unprecedented in Hollywood. Director Miloš Forman, himself an exile from communist Czechoslovakia and having a deep understanding of authoritarian grip in his marrow, desired to achieve outright veracity. To this end, he improvised scenes where actors who were auditioning for parts engaged in conversations with actual patients who were not informed they were being seen by actors. The patients would then be approached by Forman and asked to indicate those who seemed to be honest new admissions to the ward. Their input shaped his casting, so some of the greatest performances of mental illness in film were actually endorsed by individuals with those disorders. Perhaps the finest casting discovery was Will Sampson, the Native American actor who portrayed Chief Bromden. Sampson was then not an actor, but a rancher and firefighter identified by a car salesman who knew about his massive stature. When Sampson arrived on the ward, patients greeted him with respect, responding to a quiet dignity that found its way straight into his characterization of Bromden. His very presence centered the film's climax in a manner no professional actor could have duplicated. But it wasn't only the men who changed the set. Louise Fletcher, hired to play the cold Nurse Ratched, defined the film's psychological center. Fletcher was brought in as a replacement at the last minute after dozens of top actresses, Angela Lansbury and Geraldine Page among them, rejected the part, not wanting to be saddled with such an evil character. Fletcher, though, perceived not only evil but also vulnerability behind Ratched's control mask. To create this impact, she made a choice that disturbed everyone. She kept herself apart from the rest of the cast. As Nicholson and the rest of the crew formed friendships in the wards, Fletcher remained aloof, seeing little of her colleagues off-set. This deliberate distance caused genuine tension. The men were ill at ease with her, awed by her presence, and when she turned up in her spotless uniform, her hair immaculately styled, her intimidating smile, their nervousness was not fabricated. Fletcher's history predestined her to the part. Grew up as a daughter of deaf parents and learned to decipher power and communication signs short of words. She had known how caregivers infantilize those under their care, and yet felt they were doing a good thing. That lesson served as the core of Nurse Ratched, an oppressor who never yelled, whose power was based on rock-solid calm and silent domination. Fletcher's performance was so impressive that when she won the Academy Award for Best Actress, she was shunned at parties, individuals stepping back as if she were indeed the evil nurse. Ironically, the role that made her famous also constrained her career. Casting directors and audiences were unable to separate Fletcher from the character, a testament to just how thoroughly she had become Ratched. What also escapes many viewers are the layers of veiled symbolism threading through the film, carefully constructed by Forman, cinematographer Haskell Wexler, and production designer Paul Silbert. Water is presented as a pervasive symbol of freedom, coming into focus most vividly during the fishing trip sequence, the only moment the patients experience real freedom beyond the confines of the hospital walls. The design of the hospital itself, glass-enclosed nurses' stations and sterile hues, was intended to indicate surveillance and control, patients ensnared like specimens watched over day and night. Costume decisions furthered these motifs, Ratched's uniforms becoming increasingly stiff and armor-like as her dominance was threatened, while McMurphy's introducing of vibrant colors broke the ward's sterile color scheme. Even mirrors and reflections had a symbolic function, visually dividing characters' identities, especially Bromden's, until his triumphant moment of wholeness. The music written by Jack Nish combined folk instruments with mechanical hospital noises, producing an oral landscape which contrasted rebellion with control, human warmth with institutional cold. Perhaps the most haunting revelation, however, is that Ken Kesey, the novel's author, despised what the filmmakers did with his story. Kesey wanted the narrative told through Chief Bromden's perspective, as in the book, but when the filmmakers shifted the focus to McMurphy, Kesey severed ties and never even watched the finished film. The story that transformed American cinema was one its creator refused to acknowledge, and yet, in spite of its hectic journey, its danger, and its occasions of true madness, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came not only to become a work of critical acclaim, but a cultural phenomenon. It grabbed hold of something universal, the battle between individuality and conformity, freedom and captivity, rebellion and submission. Nicholson's McMurphy and Fletcher's Ratched are still two of the most iconic movie nemeses ever, representing a fight that reaches far beyond their ward to every institution in which authority weighs upon the human heart. When it opened, the movie stunned audiences not just with its graphic depiction of mental illness, but with its emotional impact. It swept the Oscars, one of just 3 movies ever to take the Big Five, and sealed its place in film history. Almost 5 decades on, its pertinence has not waned. In each slammed door, each act of subliminal rebellion, each fissure in Nurse Ratched's facade, we are reminded the battle for human dignity never truly ends. What started as Kirk Douglas's fixation, almost given up on time and time again, became a masterpiece that still provokes argument, analysis, and wonder. The unseen stories of its creation, the actual patience in its scenes, the actor's brink of collapse, the secret visual code, disclose a movie that was not only about insanity, but was conceived in it. It is a masterpiece because it did not amuse, but because it risked disturbing, confronting, and changing. And for that reason, even now, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is not merely a movie you see. It is an ordeal you endure.